arts, in Appendix B of the standards, they define ELA as including social studies, history, and technical studies. The other interesting point about the standards themselves is that they call for project-based learning, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Some teachers love it, some teachers don't. But the way project-based learning works is you pick a particular topic or theme, and you stick to that for, say, 6 weeks or 9 weeks, and you apply that topic in a multidisciplinary fashion over the course of all of your subjects. So let's say the topic for this 9 weeks is the Civil War. Then all of the child's subjects will focus on that. Their math problems will be about the Civil War, their English writing assignments will be about the Civil War, so on and so forth. And the teachers, I'm told, some get to choose the themes, some don't. It depends on whether or not they're in a very small school district or a very large school district. If you're dealing with a large district, like Little Rock School District, they have curriculum coordinators that determine all of that. So there's a lot of propaganda surrounding this reform. The first thing they'll tell you is that it's merely just a set of standards and it's only math and ELA, and that's not true. And by the way, science is coming. The next generation science standards are almost complete. Arkansas is finishing up the frameworks on that. So that whole debate, you know how that's going to go. Anytime they talk about new science in the classroom, we're going to have this whole debate now about creationism versus intelligent design, evolution, all of that. So brace yourselves. One of the other propaganda messages is that they are rigorous, college ready, and they prepare our children for a global economy. We're preparing our kids for the 21st century. Well, let's take a step back and say, what do we mean by college ready? As a parent, I'm a mother of 3. I have an 11-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 1-year-old. If I hear the term college ready, what comes to my mind is it's preparing my child for a 4-year selective college. Would that be your interpretation of college ready in a general sense? I think that's where most parents would take that. But in the appendix, where all of the nitty-gritty of the standards are, and according to a couple of the writers of the standards, what they really mean by college ready is it prepares our students for introductory classes at a 2-year non-selective college. So in Common Core speak, college ready means it's preparing our children to take remedial classes at a community college. Nothing wrong with community college. I've been to community college. We need community college. We need vocational people and vocational education and careers. But let's call a spade a spade. Okay? Most parents are thinking this means 4-year college ready, and it is clearly not. This is Jason Zimba. Jason Zimba was the lead writer of the math standards. And let's listen to what he has to say. If I can get the cursor on the mouse. Yeah, help me, I can't find it. Oh, there. Sorry. It's so sensitive.
Agreement that I believe we have on this. The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
Or some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM, it's not for international.
That's true. It's not only not for STEM, it's also not for selective colleges that, for example, UC Berkeley, even whether you're going to be an engineer or not, you better have pre-calculus to get into UC Berkeley,
right? Engineering colleges.
And that's true. I think the third pathway goes a lot towards that, but your issue is really broader than that.
Oh yes.
So I just wanted to make sure that we got that out.
I'm not just thinking of selective colleges. There's a much broader question here.
That's right. It's both, I think, in the sense of being clear about what this college readiness does and doesn't get you, and that's the big subject.
But not to call something college ready when it only applies to a certain kind of college and a certain lower level of mathematical expertise that won't buy you far on the international market in most major disciplines of technology, economics, business, and so on.
Okay, thank you.
common standards all across the country is because we're such a mobile society and our children are constantly moving across state lines. And how utopian would it be if little Johnny's in Houston, Texas one week and he moves to Little Rock, Arkansas the next week, that he could just pick up where he leaves off, and there's very little issue with transition. That's the way these common standards work. All of our teachers are on a national timeline. The expectation is that every, say, third grade classroom is doing the exact same standards the exact same week. This was one of the frustrations that one of my child's teachers had, was our class had not quite grasped a particular math subject. She really wanted to spend more time with them to make sure that they got it. And she was frustrated that she couldn't do that because she had to move on to the next thing to be part of this national schedule. That's a problem. It doesn't account for all of the socioeconomic and other challenges that we have in our local areas. So the propaganda says that we've got to accommodate these students, but the reality is when you look at the research, only 1.7% of the K through 12 student population moves across state lines. So we're making these giant sweeping changes and forcing everybody to work in a box for 1.7% of the kids. That's not to say that we don't think that there should be transitional support for those children, particularly for our military families. Certainly there should be things in place to help these kids get settled and make that transition smooth. Should that come from a national level? Probably not. And should it be forced on a local level? No. This is a very large change for 1.7% of our student population. Have you seen the fuzzy math yet? Raise your hand if you're completely frustrated with Common Core math. Okay. Here's the scoop on the math. The math, the standards call for is reform math or constructivist math. And the proponents will say, oh, you can't find that anywhere in the standards. That's curriculum, and there's no curriculum with Common Core. Baloney. That's baloney. Read the standards themselves. Read the appendix. Common Core standards is very proud of the abstract mathematical methodologies that it calls for. Next time you're on the computer, do a little research on the words reform math or constructivist math. This is not new. We've seen this math before. Those of you that are baby boomer generation or older will remember the new math from the late 1960s, early 70s. And back then, the crisis was that we were competing with who? Who remembers who the threat was back then?
Europe.
Specifically, it was Russia. It was during the Sputnik crisis. And the Russians are beating us with Sputnik. And so our kids are not doing well in math. We've got to teach them this new math to keep up with the Russians. That reform math lasted about 2 years. The parents raised all get out about it. They were protesting. They were up at the Capitol, harassing their lawmakers, and they got rid of it. So they waited a while till the next generation, and the reformers gave it a second swing of the bat. This time it was in the late 1980s. This abstract math, or reform math, or constructivist math, comes to us compliments of the National Council of Mathematics Teachers. And if you go to their website, you will see just how proud they are that their constructivist methodologies are now a part of the Common Core. What a brilliant way to push this through. It's failed 3 times before over a period of 24 years. Now they've found a way to make it a little bit more sustainable. The words that you'll see in the math standards that point to this constructivist approach include things like make an argument for the math, or draw a picture or an illustration to describe it or illustrate it in some way. Now, this gentleman is important. His name is Dr. Milgram. He's Professor Emeritus in the Department of Mathematics from Stanford University, and he used to work for NASA. This guy lives and breathes mathematics. He was on the validation committee, one of only 2 educators on that committee, and the only mathematician on that committee. And he refused to on these standards. He says, moreover, they cover very little of the content of Algebra 2 and none of any higher level course. They will not help our children match up to the students in the top foreign countries when it comes to people being hired to top level jobs. The reason I didn't sign off on them was that they did not match up to international expectations. The standards were at least 2 years behind the practices in the high-achieving countries by the 7th grade and only require a partial understanding of what would be the content of a normal solid course in Algebra 1 or geometry. The Common Core standards stop at Algebra 2. So beyond that, it's up to the local school districts or the state to figure out how they're going to make these kids college ready with math when you really have to have calculus to get into college, at least if you're looking at a 4-year university. And he's saying that the Algebra 1 and 2 are weak. The other element of reform math that you will find in the standards is the very controversial use of transformational geometry. We learned Euclidean geometry. Now, the Common Core standards bring transformational geometry, and this approach has not worked anywhere else in the world. It has failed miserably, yet here we are. This is just one example of some of the crazy math that we're seeing, where instead of just using standard algorithm to add 26 plus 17, they're asking our children to break it down into all these crazy steps in a very abstract fashion. And what really gets me is the proponents will say, we're trying to teach your kids how to think critically. How could you be against critical thinking? This isn't critical thinking. This is overcomplicating something. There's a difference between abstract thinking and critical thinking. This is abstract, and our children in elementary school are concrete. They're concrete thinkers. It's cognitively inappropriate. Now let's talk about the ELA standards a little bit. This is Dr. Sandra Stotsky. She's an Arkansas native from U of A. And after she did wonderful things here at the U of A, she moved on to Massachusetts and led education reform in the state of Massachusetts, wrote their standards, which now we know were a much higher caliber for the state of Massachusetts than the Common Core standards are. Did you know that Massachusetts scored higher on the international benchmarks than any other state in our country? Did you know that Massachusetts outperformed China and several other top countries if you isolate their scores? Why aren't we doing what Massachusetts was doing? That's the question. She says that the ELA standards are of poor quality, they are an empty skill set, there is a de-emphasis on established literature and a concentration of 50% or more on informational text, and the reading levels are low. 7th grade reading level for a 12th grader. Now, the informational text thing is a really important thing for you to look at. When you look at the standards, go to Appendix B and you will see a graph that outlines the informational text. It starts at 50%, and as they get close, which I think it starts in 5th grade, and as they get up to 12th grade, it increases to 70%. Informational text is the opposite of established literature. Informational text is biased. The point of informational text is to convince you of a certain something. Examples of informational text could be an article from Newsweek magazine, or a government document, or an instruction manual, a YouTube video. They're current event or manual type pieces of reading. Anybody can create an informational text and align it to the Common Core standards. There's a government study that was done back in 2004 that compared the international benchmark scores between children who had an emphasis on established literature and children who had an emphasis on informational text. The children who had an emphasis on established literature scored 6% higher than the international benchmark. The children who had an emphasis on informational text scored 4% lower than the international benchmark. So we have now accepted a set of standards that are destined to put our children at a 10% deficit internationally. But these are internationally benchmark. That's what they'll tell you. That's not true. They're not. The other important thing to note about Drs. Milgram and Stotsky is that they were the only two educators on the validation committee. They are the only two who refused to sign off, and after that they were simply expunged from the record. And now these two spend their retirement going to educational forums and conferences all over the country trying to educate parents about their experience and what's being done in our local classrooms, when they should be probably sitting on the beach with a Mai Tai right now. David Coleman. David Coleman was the chief ELA architect, the English language writer. He, at the time, was president of a company called Achieve Inc., which is a DC trade group that was hired to write the standards. He's not a teacher. He's not an educator. He's an educrat. When asked about the debate between focusing on established literature and informational text, this is his very academic response. As you grow up in this world, you really realize that people really don't give a bleep about what you feel or what you think. It is rare in a working environment that someone says, Johnson, I need a market analysis by Friday, but before that I need a compelling account of your childhood. See, the reality is that established literature takes our children to another time and place. It exposes them to different cultures, different time periods, complicated vocabulary. It presents them with multiple characters that have multiple points of view and puts them in a position of trying to think critically for themselves about how they feel about a particular issue or a course of action. That's critical thinking. That's what established literature does. Informational text says, here's why you should believe something is so. That's not critical thinking, that's programming. Big difference. Oh, Arnie Duncan. Arnie Duncan is the United States Secretary of Education. He was appointed by our current president back in 2009. He's never taught in a classroom in his life. His mother was a teacher, though. Somehow, he managed to make it as the CEO of the Chicago public school system and ran it into the ground. I know this firsthand. I'm a Chicago native. I grew up in inner city Chicago. He's a professional basketball player, though, so there's that. He says in a speech that he gave to UNESCO back in 2010, traditionally the federal government in the U.S. has had a limited role in education policy. The current administration has sought to fundamentally shift that role. That's illegal, folks. It's a violation of at least 2 federal mandates in our 10th Amendment. We'll get into that later. So here's the big picture. Common Core is more than standards. The thing is that the standards are the glue that hold all of these pieces together. You can't make all of these others work unless you've got the standards as your common denominator, so to speak. These are, it's listed here as the 4 pillars, but the Department of Ed calls them the 4 assurances. Okay, these are the 4 assurances that the United States Department of Education declared as their education reform package. These were discussed in Arnie Duncan's speech to UNESCO in 2010. I encourage all parents to get online and look up Arnie Duncan's speech to UNESCO, UNESCO, 2009, and also the 2010 speech. You need to read those because he's declaring to the United Nations what their intentions are for education in America. Okay? It's important to read. These 4 assurances include the adoption of national standards and national assessments. So our national standards are the Common Core assessments. The assessments are the PARCC and Smarter Balanced exams. The second piece, or the second assurance, has to do with establishing what are called SLDSs, State Longitudinal Database Systems. Those systems are set up to collect P20 data on individual students, which means preschool to age 20. What they want is a cradle to career big data tracking on individual students. The third piece includes teacher accountability measures. In the state of Arkansas, that's the TESS system, T-E-S-S. And what the United States Department of Education specifically calls for here is for teacher evaluations to be tied to these new standardized tests. And then the last one, or the fourth assurance, is turning around low-performing schools. And what the United States Department of Education means by turning around is closing and then replacing with corporate, for-profit charter schools. They want to expand corporate charter schools. So those are the four assurances. And the way you tie all of this together is when we filled out our race to the top grant money, okay, and when we signed the PARC testing agreement, we had to agree to put these things in place. So as a state, we agreed to all four of these things in exchange for accepting money from the federal government. Okay? So people will say, this isn't Common Core, you're not going to find it in the standards. It is Common Core. You won't find it in the standards. You find it in our Race to the Top application, and you find it in our PARC agreement, our testing agreement. That's where you find it. Keep going? Okay. Common Core violates 3 laws: the General Education Provisions Act, the Department of Education Organization Act, and ESEA of 1965. The Department of Education wasn't even created until 1979. The United States Department of Education is younger than me. Think about that. They're a pretty young department. Back in the late 1960s, when they were pushing this new math and everyone was getting up in arms about education reform, people were resisting this. They were scared to death about the federal government sticking its nose in education, because the lawmakers at the time knew the danger of that. We've seen what has happened to other countries. This is one of the big reasons why we broke from Britain in the first place, is to get away from all of that federal control and that federal influence. And so they built amendments into these laws to try to protect us now, years and years later. And these laws are being violated. The federal government is not to exercise any direction, any supervision, or any control over the curriculum, program, anything to do with education. They're simply not supposed to do it. The way they got started with it was in 1965, when they passed that first law. They said, we're stepping in because we want to use tax dollars to help disadvantaged children. That's how they got their foot in the door. We're going to start funneling money because we need to increase results for disadvantaged children. They have been doing this for 40 years and the scores aren't getting any higher. They keep throwing more money at it. Now